There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst the planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. So it's only a single sentence, but he's making the point that all this stuff is purely scientific and like the law of gravity. It's not something mystical and spiritual, but at the same time he wants to make it very sort of grand and majestic. Well, obviously he was under fantastic pressure, both by his religious critics and his religious friends, and his wife, who was intensely Christian. And he also needed people to read his book and take it seriously, and he was promoting his book. So the first edition sold out on the first day, and within 2 months he had a second edition with all sorts of corrections. He spoiled, in my opinion, the very last beautiful sentence. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or one. Totally changed. Not only the sentence, but really the thrust of the whole book in many ways. So he put it in and instantly regretted it. So this probably looks like a perfectly ordinary library with functional shelving, nice bright lighting, but to a historian of science, it is a treasure trove because it contains the entire corpus of Charles Darwin's work and whatever anybody else has written about it. So Darwin's works were translated into 25 different languages, and the most translated volume of all, of course, is On the Origin of Species. And it's interesting to compare translations because sometimes translators changed a little bit what Darwin said to fit what they thought he ought to have said. And a collection like this is extraordinarily useful in allowing scholars to work out just how Darwin's work was received in different countries. There's a whole range of languages. Here we have, for instance, Hebrew. Here I know that's Russian. Here it is in Spanish by Carlo Darwin. Here it is in Japanese, particularly beautiful in the Japanese script. An abstract of an essay on the origin of species and varieties through natural selection by Charles Darwin, M.A., blah, blah, blah. And we always call it The Origin, or sometimes The Origin of Species, but it's actually On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. I started my career as an evolutionary biologist and then became more of a historian of science. But as I say, I really didn't want to get to terms with Darwin until about 12 years ago, when I was here working in the Society Library. The librarian, Martin Levitt, he was then the librarian, gave me this object, which is a photocopy of a document in Darwin's execrable handwriting. Here is the original. It is Darwin's idea of what the title page of his most important book, The Origin of Species, would actually look like. And it's quite different from what the title page of The Origin of Species actually does look like. It's beautifully, simply written. It is the most elegant exposition of science that you can imagine. It doesn't get tied up in all sorts of jargon, and it's really can be given to students as an example of elegant scientific writing for composition students. I mean, I really admire the simple way in which he expresses himself, and it's the sort of simplicity that everybody should aim for. But I never tried in any way to emulate him, or I would just grind to a halt if I did that. The journal American Scientist has a column called Marginalia, and it was written by a dear friend of mine who was an extraordinary ecologist named G. Evelyn Hutchinson. And when he retired from that, I was asked to take it on. And what I discovered was that I really, all this time, was not a historian, a biologist, but I was actually a writer. And I did write on every subject, from how you ride a horse to how sharks swim to Darwin's use of rhetoric and whatnot. It was just a fantastic opportunity, and I sort of gradually morphed away from doing laboratory science into becoming a writer. So I've been in museums ever since I was an undergraduate, one way or the other. And there's a funny thing about natural history museums. They each have a different smell down in the basement from the preservatives they use and that stuff. So I could, used to say, I don't know if I still could, I could go into almost any natural history museum in the world and go with eyes shut and say, oh, I know where we are. We're in the basement of the, let's see, Los Angeles Museum of Science, or, hey, is this the Peabody? Libraries are really quite clean and nice and well lit, and they just smell sort of like books. What could be better than smelling like books?